Okay, so now we're recording. So the house rules for today, we appreciate if you could keep yourself on mute until the Q&A session, just so we don't have any background noise. And if you can hold any questions until we have the Q&A session, that way we'll get through the information and we'll be happy to answer all of your questions. If you can, I know you may have other questions about transit and Tulsa Transit in general. For this meeting, we want to try to keep the questions relevant to microtransit, just so we can be a good use of our time for this meeting. If you do have questions when the consultants are going through some of the information, if you can pose your questions in the chat section, or if you can use the raise hand feature, if you need clarification on any slides, and we'll be happy to address those questions that you have. When you do have questions, please be mindful of time. We have a finite time for the public meeting. So we want everyone to be heard, and we want to hear your questions too. So if you can just keep your questions succinct, that would be wonderful, and we appreciate that. We know some people might be joining by phone. So if you are, and if you have questions, you can email those questions to info@tulsatransit.org. And that way we'll be able to address your questions as well if we're not seeing you pose any questions here in this online chat. So what I'd like to do right now is introduce Leanne Alfaro. She's the Planning and Marketing Director for Tulsa Transit, and she would like to introduce the Tulsa Transit members who are on the call today. Leanne?
Thank you, Barrett. First and foremost, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to dig into this type of mode of transit that we could offer. And we are really looking forward to your feedback to what our contractors have decided to tell us that they think would be recommended areas for us to provide this type of service. Barrett already told you, I am the Planning and Marketing Director with Tulsa Transit. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Scott Marr, which is our new General Manager for Tulsa Transit, and let him introduce himself a little bit. Scott?
Thank you, Leanne. My name is Scott Marr. I'm the newer General Manager for Tulsa Transit, been on board for about 3 weeks now. I'm extremely excited about this opportunity for Microtransit to cover the services in parts of North Tulsa and Sand Springs. Microtransit is a great opportunity to provide service to our customers to get them to and from where they need to go. So I'm really excited about this opportunity, and I think this will change transit for the areas that it will service. Thanks, Leanne.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. And then finally on our team from Tulsa Transit, we have Chase Phillips. He is the Assistant Director of Service Development. Chase, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so as Leanne mentioned, I'm effectively the Assistant Planning Director. Super excited about this project. Really glad you all are here today. I'm glad these conversations are kind of coming to fruition in the community, and looking forward to seeing an actual pilot project on the ground. So.
Great, thank you. And with that, Barrett, if you don't mind to introduce the rest of the team, that would be great.
You bet. So I'd also like to introduce the consultants who have been working on the project. With HNTB, and you'll be hearing more from all of them, but Allison Bushwright, Ryan Billings, and John Dobies. And I'll let you guys talk later as you're going through the plan. And then also want to introduce Carol Schweiger, who is with Schweiger Consulting and kind of our transit technology expert. I would also like to introduce Christy White with Propeller, who serves on my team as well. So we're happy that you're here again today. And right now, I'd like to turn everything over to Allison so she can get started going through the process and talk more about microtransit. Allison?
Thanks, everyone. Great to see everyone at this meeting. I'm Allison Bushwhack with HNTB. Welcome to everyone who was at our previous public meeting, and welcome to those who are new to this project. We've designed our presentation today to make sure this is understandable by everyone who attended either the previous meeting or is again new to the project. So our meeting purpose today, I want to go over the project goal. So we're hoping that microtransit will better serve rider markets where microtransit would be a good fit. And that's where we're currently seeing lower ridership or low ride demand. And also the goal of this project is to make sure that the costs to Tulsa Transit are staying neutral. So we are only evaluating replacement of existing services where the cost would be the same if we were to replace them with Microtransit. The feedback we'd like to get from you all today is on our zone criteria assessment and the pilot recommendations that we'll be revealing in a few slides. Also, we'll be going over some of the service standards that we will be passing along to a vendor that will respond to an RFP for this pilot, and also some of the pilot performance measures to make sure that we are reviewing this program and determining whether it's a successful thing that the agency will want to implement more permanently. So a quick review of where we are today. We kicked this project off last fall. We've gone through an initial evaluation of 6 microtransit zones, and now we have taken a closer look at those over the past couple of months. We presented that information to our stakeholder group a couple of weeks ago, and now we're continuing on to the next step, which is to present that to all of you, making sure that we're getting your feedback as well. Ryan's going to be talking a little bit more about next steps toward the end of the presentation, so I will save that for him. A quick recap of the public outreach that we've done and the feedback we've received from the public to date. We had our first public meeting a couple months ago, and at that time we released a survey to get some more responses, both from people that were able to attend the meeting, but also for those that weren't able to attend the meeting. We had about 25 responses from residents around Tulsa. As you can see in the graph, we are happy to see that many respondents were in support of this project. Few were neutral, and only a couple were not in favor of the project. We also had an open-ended response field to just welcome any comments that someone might have on the project. And the general themes we saw in those responses was that people want to ensure that the service is accessible to all Tulsans of all ability levels. And the other thing that we saw was that the service should be targeting those who depend on transit the most. And so just a refresher of what we went over at the first public meeting, we presented 6 zones for consideration, and those are shown in the 2 maps on the right. One is a grouping of zones that would be in service only in the evenings and Sundays. So those are sort of replacement of Nightline and existing Sunday services. And then we also took a look at 2 zones that would replace daytime service routes of the Workforce Express network and the Broken Arrow Route 508. And so in our initial public meeting, we looked at high-level information on land use in these zones, the income levels of the residents in these zones, and presence of affordable housing. We also talked about the existing ridership in the routes in those zones and looked at whether they'd be appropriate for replacement. At that point, we also recommended doing a deeper evaluation of the zones to move forward into the pilot, and that will be the bulk of what we're presenting today. At that meeting, we also introduced some conceptual service concepts, things like wait times, how to transfer, and the type of model we'd be using for this service, and standards for vehicles, things like that. So we'll talk a little bit further about that today. And oh yes, we also talked about the technology of microtransit at that time as well. Okay, so now we're going to move into the process we took to evaluate the 6 zones further. For that, we employed 5 different criteria for the evaluation. I'm going to take some time on this slide to talk you all through the 5 different criteria that we used. So viability of select Nightline, and other services. we were focusing on which existing services in the Tulsa Transit network had an hourly average ridership of around 2.5 to 6 passengers per hour. That really tells us that's the sweet spot for being able to replace with microtransit. If it tips to more than around 6 passengers per hour, then it's probably more cost efficient to stick with fixed route transit. And we also were looking at routes in terms of how they support the overall transit network. Are the routes that we're looking at primary feeders? Do they go into downtown, or are they more secondary or circulator routes that tend to stay on the periphery of the system? As far as ridership potential, we created an estimate of the passengers that would use microtransit in each of the zones. Our estimates were based on the total land area of each zone proposed, what's called transit propensity index, and that's basically the likelihood of the residents within the zone taking a microtransit ride. And then lastly, a service attractiveness factor, and that's just considering how much more attractive is microtransit in terms of its convenience compared to fixed route service.
Allison, if I can just interrupt,
Sure.
We're getting a little bit of conversation in the background. There may be 1 or 2 people who are calling in. If you can try to make sure that there's no one talking in the background, or if there's any way you can go someplace where we're not getting any background conversation, that would be really helpful. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on to equity, what we used to look at that measure was the transit propensity index that I mentioned a few moments ago. So that tool was also used in this because transit propensity by definition is looking at populations that have historically been dependent on transit. And those include minority populations, populations below poverty, 65 years and older, those with disabilities, and zero-car households. So we want to make sure that we are serving those individuals that typically rely on transit. And so that's what we were looking at with our equity measure. Our cost criterion is an evaluation of whether the cost of the microtransit service and replacing the proposed route in its zone is staying cost neutral. Costs were really driven by our estimate of ridership and how many vehicles it would require to serve that ridership demand and the hours that they would be in service. Lastly, I'll say the first 4 measures that I just described are quantitative measures. That was all a lot of number crunching. Our 5th criterion is the suitability for a pilot, and that's a more qualitative measure. And I'll walk you all through that one individually for each zone. So a summary of the results of all of our quantitative criteria, we can see here that for both the viability of existing service and ridership potential, all of our 6 zones sort of passed through that screening criteria. For the viability, basically we looked at each of the current nightline services or those 2 daytime services and calculated that each of them are in fact replacing routes that fall within the 2 to 6 passengers per hour. So all of the zones would qualify under that criterion. For ridership potential in our estimates using the method that I described, we know that all of the zones would produce sufficient ridership to be serviced. As far as equity and cost, these are the 2 criteria that start to eliminate zones from moving forward through to the pilot. So for equity, when we looked at that transit propensity index score, all of our zones are in places of transit need or score greater than 1, which means there's a presence of populations that depend on transit. So we're not saying any of these places don't meet a need for service. But as far as picking 2 zones to move forward into the pilot, there were the 3 zones that are checked here that had the highest transit propensity. So that would be the Northwest, North, and Workforce Express zones. I have a question mark next to the Workforce Express zone because there's a little bit of data bias in that zone because there are so few residences out in that northeast section. It's mostly industrial properties out there that sort of there's a little bias in terms of the score and applying that to a very large area. And then lastly, our conclusions for cost. The zones that were able to stay cost neutral or not introduce any more cost to replace existing services were the Northwest, North, and Workforce Express zones again. And what that can indicate is that for the other zones, our East, West, and Broken Arrow, that can suggest a few things. Either those zones could be, if we wanted to pursue microtransit service there at a later date, those zones could be redrawn to serve smaller markets. You could also reduce the span of time that the vehicles would be in operation, or might just determine that the existing fixed routes there are more efficient than replacement with microtransit service. So now I'll talk us through the pilot suitability qualitative criterion. So this assessment was looking at each zone and its suitability for a pilot, including what is the overall administrative lift on the agency to implement any one of these zones? What's the potential travel patterns, the number of potential travel patterns and variables that drive them? And that's important because we're trying to use a pilot to measure its success. We want to sort of minimize the number of variables we have to study so that we can take lessons learned and move into future implementation. We also want to look at whether any of these zones are able to support the broader fixed route transit network and investments that the transit agency is making in BRT, both with the existing Peoria service and the future Route 66 service. We're also going to look at overall zone size. It's just easier to start with a smaller geographic size. It's a little more manageable for a pilot. And then lastly, I'll point out any other considerations that are relevant to a specific zone. So for the Northwest zone, we have a little map in the corner to show you which part of Tulsa we're focusing on for this. We have in our pro list or our advantage list for this criterion that the zone serves a previously unserved area of Tulsa. There's a current nightline route that is more on the east side, but for the whole swath of this zone that reaches over to the west, that's offering a service that is not there today in the evening. It's a nice small geographic size. It also pairs well with the north zone because taking these 2 zones together, there can be a full replacement of 2 nightline/Sunday routes, and that's more of a cost benefit. And then the zone also connects to Peoria BRT, and therefore it offers lessons learned as far as how well microtransit and fixed route service can work together. And I'll point out here that I will be emphasizing whether or not these zones connect to BRT or fast and frequent service, but microtransit can be used for a 1-seat ride within the zone. So this is not only a transfer service to other fixed route bus network, but it can also be used singly as a 1-seat ride. You can take a microtransit vehicle to any destination within the zone. So moving on to the north zone, this has a lot of similarities to the northwest zone. There's again increased cost savings with replacement of 2 nightline and Sunday routes. It is also a relatively small geographic size. It's also connecting to the Peoria BRT and again offers us lessons learned from how well microtransit can support connections to other fixed route service. And what's unique to this zone is that it includes a connection to the Tulsa International Airport, and that could be a benefit to airport employees who might be needing to get to and from their jobs in the evening or on Sundays. For this zone and the last one, for this specific criterion, there were no disadvantages. So for the east zone, I'll start out with the disadvantage list since that one is longer. This zone we know is just too large to serve at this point for a pilot specifically. It's a very large size, and that means there are a lot of different travel patterns happening. And by that, I mean people are starting and ending in different places within the zones. We currently have a few Nightline service routes in there, so it's really hard to pin down where are the major travel patterns happening to shrink this zone down to a more manageable size. We think that it would be better approached if we go ahead and pilot a smaller geographic size elsewhere in Tulsa and apply those lessons learned into how we could create smaller microtransit zones in this part of the region. The positive for this zone is that there is a future connection to the Route 66 BRT. So again, that would be a positive in terms of supporting the broader Tulsa transit network. For the west zone, some positives about this zone as far as suitability is that it's a nice concise area, at least west of the Arkansas River. It's a nice geographically isolated area. Travel patterns are probably limited to east-west travel. It would also allow for a full replacement of Route 490 and the cost savings that would be associated with that replacement. It also connects to the Peoria BRT and would offer us lessons learned on being able to connect to fast and frequent service. Some disadvantages with this zone is that it is larger in size relative to some of the other zones. It only partially covers Nightline and Sunday Route 440, which would, not get us a bigger cost savings, and it would also require a potential route modification. So that just introduces some other variables and potential confusion or more learning on the public side to introduce a new route design. Okay, so our last two zones are our daytime zones. For Workforce Express, we had identified as far as suitability a couple of negatives, and really that is the Workforce Express network was created to serve employees of some of the large industrial employers in the Northwest. And so we're calling that a unique needs market. And therefore, we think that's a little too limiting for a pilot if we are trying to learn how we can expand microtransit service to other parts of Tulsa. We don't want to be looking at one specific market. We want to be looking at a zone that's serving all Tulsa residents. The other difficulty or challenge with this zone is that the current service is paid for by a temporary funding source. So funding would need to be identified to have this zone move into a pilot. Okay, so our last zone for pilot suitability that we are going to review is Broken Arrow. This zone has a lot of positives as far as suitability, including the existing Route 508 functions similarly to microtransit. The route deviates, and this is a service that's already familiar to the community there. We know from a past study that the Broken Arrow community favors microtransit service, so we know that's something that's desired by that community. Additionally, this is a nice geographically contained part of the region. So again, that's sort of reducing the number of travel patterns and a limitation on the overall rider demand that we might have. And then lastly, the only negative with this this zone is that there's no connections to fast and frequent service or a BRT line. So we would not be able to learn how microtransit service can complement a BRT service. Okay, so looking at all 5 criteria together, both our quantitative and our qualitative criteria, we're looking at the 2 zones, northwest and north, that are sort of checking the boxes for everything. So it is probably no surprise at this point that our recommendation for moving 2 zones into a pilot are the northwest and north zones. And just to go over again why these are the ones that we are recommending at this point is that the estimated number of riders in these zones are in the optimal zone for microtransit service and at an affordable cost, meaning it will not cost more to the agency to replace the current services there. And I'll just emphasize again, this is only replacing nightline and Sunday service, not any daytime service. We also know that there are high transit propensity populations that would benefit from improved quality of service. The zone boundaries and connections would increase access to Peoria BRT and leverage that investment that the Tulsa community has made. The zones are geographically small in size, and complementary to that small size, there's fewer variables to discern for pilot lessons learned. And there's, again, the cost savings of replacing 2 full nightline and Sunday routes, 110 and 401. And I will take a moment to read through, or I'm going to describe for those on our call that might not be able to see the map very well. I'm going to describe the boundaries of these 2 zones. So starting with the northwest zone, I'm going to read the boundaries in a clockwise direction. So starting with the northern boundary, we have Apache Street bounding that northern line. Moving to the east, we're bounded by the Peoria BRT, Interstate 244, and Denver Avenue. To the south of the zone, we're bounded by the Arkansas River. And on the west side of the zone, it's sort of split into 2 western boundaries. So below Edison Street, the boundary is 65th Avenue, so reaching all the way to the west of the corporate limits. Then we have Edison Street all the way to 33rd Avenue. So north of Edison Street, the western boundary is 33rd Avenue, and then 33rd Avenue meets back up to the northern boundary on Apache Street. For the north zone, again, I'll start at the top and move around clockwise. On the north side, we're bounded by 56th Street. Then the zone follows Cherokee Expressway, Gilcrease Expressway, and Memorial Drive to the east. The southern boundary is Admiral Place. Then we, moving west, as that southern boundary hits Peoria BRT, it moves up. So we're bounded by Peoria BRT on the west, south of Apache Street, and north of Apache Street, the zone reaches over to Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Okay, so we've described sort of our whole zone evaluation process and reached our 2 recommended zones. Now I want to take some time and sort of paint the picture for everyone as much as possible, what it will actually be like to take microtransit in Tulsa with this new proposed evening network and Sunday network design. With some walking through this anatomy of a trip, and also I'll walk through a few examples of trips that can be made. And the anatomy of the trip, we're looking at really the benefit of microtransit and want to describe sort of the convenience, both in terms of saved time that the service can offer, but also convenience of avoiding some of the walking or being exposed to the elements to get to another transit vehicle, and also just sort of removing some of the stresses in terms of transfers or having to figure out when you need to get to your bus stop. So for a fixed route trip, we're looking at walking to a bus stop. That can be inconvenient or difficult depending on where you're starting or stopping, and you're obviously exposed to outdoor elements. You usually add a buffer of time for waiting for a bus if you're transferring to one. Then you have the bus ride itself, and because fixed route is by definition, it's fixed and it's stopping certain places, you're not going to be able to deviate from it. That can probably be less efficient than taking a microtransit trip in terms of taking the most efficient route to get to your destination. At the other end of your bus ride, you will also need to walk to your final destination or make a transfer to your next bus ride. So an on-demand trip, by comparison, we would estimate cuts that trip by a third potentially. This would be obviously dependent on the specific trip need, but overall, we think that the microtransit ride would be faster in overall travel time. There's also the minimization of the first part of a trip for fixed route. You can totally eliminate the need to walk to get to anywhere to be picked up by a vehicle. The microtransit vehicle is going to come to the curb outside of your starting point. The wait for your ride, this is part of our service standard conversation, but we're aiming for a wait time of 15 to 20 minutes between when you make your first reservation request and when you're actually picked up. Then the microtransit ride itself, obviously that's specific to where you're going, how long that will be, but we're making the assumption that that route will be a direct route rather than having to take a fixed route. And then finally, we're eliminating again that final walk to the destination point because you will be dropped off at the curb outside of your destination. So now to walk us through a few example trips. So our first sample trip, we are pretending that we are a rider starting at Union Avenue and Pine Street in our northwest zone. And the rider needs to get to the Denver Avenue station. So that rider would use an app or call into the agency to reserve their ride. And then they would have a one-seat ride in a microtransit vehicle all the way to Denver Avenue station. Okay, in our next example, let's say you're starting in the west portion of the northwest zone and you want to get to the Tulsa Tech Peoria campus. You would make your reservation for a microtransit vehicle getting picked up at 49th and Charles Page Boulevard. The vehicle would pick you up there and take the most efficient route along the roadway network, drop you off at the Pine and Peoria Avenue station for the Peoria BRT, and you would make your transfer and the BRT would drop you off near the station at Tulsa Tech. Our third sample trip is in the north zone, starting at 45th and Lewis Avenue, and our rider would like to get to the Tulsa International Airport. Similar to our first example, this is a one-seat ride, so a rider would simply hail microtransit. The vehicle should arrive within 15 to 20 minutes, and they get that one-seat ride and a direct route all the way to the airport. And then our last example is again in the north zone and an example of a transfer. So starting at 46th and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, I hail my microtransit ride, get picked up and dropped at the nearest BRT station. And then the BRT would take us all the way into downtown Tulsa. And I should have mentioned the transfer point at the Peoria BRT is at 46th and Peoria Avenue. So generally the transfer point is going to be closest to the starting point, and that allows the vehicle to deliver the passenger to transfer to BRT and get back out into the network to serve another passenger.
So we talked about this triangle and Joe Perry will talk about.
All right, so now I'm going to walk through some service and program performance recommendations. So these are the things that we will be writing into an RFP when we make it public for vendors to bid on. These are the things that we're requiring or asking for this service. And so some of these we know are things that Tulsa Transit can set themselves. So for fare policies, we would be recommending that they are reflective of current fare policies. So Microtransit, we're intending the service to be fully integrated with all of the other Tulsa Transit offerings. The fare should reflect this in terms of the fare levels and the transfer privileges as well. So you won't be paying for two separate rides, one on Microtransit and one on Tulsa Transit. It's considered one Tulsa Transit ride. So fare levels and fare policy will be the same. Base fare of $1.75 with the various fare discounts, depending on whether you're youth, using or you're military. The fare will also change based on whether you're using an express route, and everything else that we're showing on this table. Fares can be paid using the Microtransit app, a prepaid pass, using GoPass, or using cash, but exact fare only. Okay, so getting into transfers. So as I mentioned earlier, Microtransit can be used for a one-seat ride if you're starting and ending within the same zone. If you do need to transfer, we have some recommendations for how we would like those transfers to be accommodated. Excuse me, the transfers will be made at nearby bus stations for both fixed routes, or if you're going from either Microtransit zone to the other Microtransit zone. For now, for the pilot, our recommendation is to not allow passengers to cross zones without transferring Microtransit vehicles. And that just keeps the service request time and wait time dependable for other users of the service. The transfer station must be safely accessible. And then we will also be recommending that the vendor explore scheduled transfers. And what that means is designing or having the technology behind Microtransit pick you up. If we know you're going to be transferring to fixed route service, go ahead and pick you up and drop you off in a way that minimizes your wait time at the bus station. So again, trying to maximize your convenience and not make you wait at the station longer than necessary. In order to accommodate transfers, our team is also recommending that the Peoria BRT operate until 11 p.m. on weekdays and Saturdays, or extending the current Nightline and Sunday Route 805 north into the Microtransit zones.
I did hear from Rick Griffin that
Okay. For these service standard recommendations, these are things that we mostly introduced at our previous public meeting, but thought it worthwhile to review. And also based on what we heard at the last public meeting, accessibility was something that's really important to Tulsans. So we have a couple of standards when we put out an RFP, we are saying are non-negotiable. So that includes accessible vehicles, accessible methods for reservations and notifications. And another non-negotiable would be curb to curb pickup and drop off. In our previous presentation, we had talked about having pickup or drop off points that would require walking a distance to get to your pickup or drop off place. We're not going to be doing that. We're wanting to make sure we have the convenience of having your pickup location right outside your door, similar with drop off. Again, we want to be requesting a 15-minute wait time between your request and pickup. We think that is the advantage of this service, is having that minimized wait time. We also are recommending a TNC backstop service. This is a concept we're introducing new today. Wasn't talked about at our last meeting, but basically what this means is if for some reason there's a surge in demand and there are not enough agency or Tulsa Transit Agency vehicles available, the app will automatically offer the rider a TNC ride. And a TNC is a technical term for transportation network company that is the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world. So it would be offering a ride alternative if a wait time exceeds our expectation, to go ahead and offer the rider a ride with Uber or Lyft. And that's still it's still at the same fare. And this is basically a way to ensure standard of service without having to invest in additional vehicles that wouldn't be used most of the time. This would only be needed in surge times or times of high demand. Lastly, we will be recommending ride pooling. So if you are making a ride request and it's similar, your travel needs or your route that you need is similar to someone else that's making a request around the same time, your microtransit vehicle will go ahead and pick up both of you. And that is for cost efficiency. Again, we want to emphasize the accessibility features of this service. So the vehicles themselves will be wheelchair accessible, but also engaging with the reservation and the notification process. Those will also be able to accommodate those with hearing or seeing challenges. Okay, so almost concluding my portion of the presentation, lastly wanted to talk about how we're going to measure pilot program performance. This is important because we're making this investment in the pilot. We want to make sure we are tracking how it's going and being able to determine at the end if this was a worthwhile investment and something that should be moved out of pilot phase and into permanence. Also, it will allow us to see if we should be piloting microtransit in any other areas of Tulsa, either with some of the zones that didn't move into the pilot at this phase or designing a different zone that we haven't introduced yet. So we'll be tracking what the actual costs are to operate the service. We'll also be looking at the number of riders being served, and this is both how many people are using it for the first time and how many people are using the service over and over. The idea being, if you have repeat riders, it's a service that is more worthwhile. We'll also be looking at where people are starting and ending their trips to determine what are the popular trips, and also just how is the service being used. We'll be tracking whether those starting and ending points are beyond the typical shed that's served by fixed routes that we're replacing. So generally, individuals will not, or the general shed around an existing route is about half a mile, and that's about 10 minutes of walking. It can be up to a mile if people are willing to walk 20 minutes to a bus stop. So we want to see our people starting and ending trips beyond that buffer around a fixed route. And that would indicate that this service is reaching more individuals and allowing for more mobility. And lastly, we'll be asking for rider feedback. So similar to the way we've been engaging you in the past, and today with our survey, we'll be asking riders for their opinions and on how the service is going. All right, so now I'd like to open it up. Thank you all for listening. I know that's a lot of talking for the last 40 minutes or so. We'd like to open up the floor to individuals. If you'd like to go ahead and unmute and give us any thoughts you have on the presentation so far, whether you have questions to clarify material or just want to share your opinions.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for the-
I guess I can start the conversation with a question about the two recommended zones. Does that network of having the two zones in the north look useful to anyone attending our meeting today? I see a thumbs up from Nancy.
Hi, this is Talisa. Thank you so much for the information this morning. I would say absolutely the Northwest. I am the director of Pearls Hope, and we are in that area, and we provide transitional living for moms and their children. And so one of the things we try to do is help our moms find employment. And that is so difficult because of the nearest transit, they have to walk, and it's not a safe walking distance. There's no sidewalks. So it really hampered their ability to be successful. And we are only one transitional living program in that area. There are numerous transitional programs in that area that's helping the homeless. So we are so excited to hear that that zone was chosen. So thank you guys so very much.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Nancy Moran. And I think the Northwest Zone is really great because of the proximity to the Tulsa Health Department at 56th Street North in Cincinnati, or sorry, Martin Luther King. And also, I wondered, would these be vans or SUVs? And is there any possibility that they could be electric vehicles? Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I think we'll be furthering our requirements for vehicles in the RFP process. So that's helpful to hear your feedback. And let us know if certain vehicle types are important to you. I think the only standard we've established at this point is that we want to make sure that the fleet is wheelchair accessible.
Yeah.
This is City Councilor Kara Joy McKee. Thank you for this great presentation, y'all. This is excellent, Allison. I'm so excited about what you have shared. I'll echo what Nancy said. You know, we are enthusiastic about moving any fleet within Tulsa toward electric vehicles, and we'll be talking about that more in the city discussion as well. I also just wanted to put out there, I know Councilors Q and Patrick have been enthusiastic for some of their areas to be more covered, and Councilor Patrick, especially in the Northeast. I just, I think that focusing the pilots where you've got them makes absolute sense. You've got those check marks taken care of. And if there is more interest in having some in the East, because we have so many new employers there, I wonder if they might be interested in partnering to pilot for one of those loops, if it was of interest to go ahead and get that started for that workforce area.
I guess as a follow-up, I want to emphasize that the two microtransit zones proposed for the pilot are for nightline service and Sunday spans of service. So really weekday and Saturday evenings and Sundays. I just wanted to clarify that some of the comments we received, including yours, sounds like you're thinking about daytime service. Is that correct?
Oh, that's a good reminder. I had heard you say that, and I had forgotten by the time we got to the Q&A part, but that absolutely makes sense. I know there will be some employment that extends into the evening and on the weekends, but you're right, that's not the primary time to be covered. So that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's an important consideration. We're trying to emphasize that because we want to start with a smaller rider market. If we have too much ridership demand, that makes the service no longer cost effective. But I think it's still important to hear about these potentially daytime needs and how, if there's any future application of this service that could work for those needs.
Excellent.
Real quick, Leonard, I wasn't sure if I saw that you had a hand up. I didn't know if you had a question.
I did. It was referring to more so the future for the daytime routes. The Broken Arrow doesn't connect with anything coming into Tulsa. So like she mentioned, for the future, it would be good for the Broken Arrow route to either connect with the future Route 66 route or even the current 310 route. I'm a bus driver, so I hear these requests every now and then of people wanting to get into Broken Arrow from a Tulsa route.
Leonard, can you repeat the other route? I heard the BRT 66, Route 66 BRT. What was the other one?
Right now, the 310 goes closest to Broken Arrow, but it doesn't actually connect with the current Broken Arrow route. So if you're going to replace that in the future, then you may consider making it available to connect with Tulsa routes so that people from Broken Arrow can get into Tulsa from Broken Arrow.
Okay. Oh, I see a question in the chat. How come none of the southern routes are mentioned? Alexis, can you help me a little bit with what you're asking? Are you asking why our zones are not covering the southern routes?
I'm just curious because where I live is off of Lewis, but it's more south than north. And so I was just curious why Microtransit wouldn't be on the Yale routes or the Harvard routes or the Lewis routes. Like, I get Peoria is popular. Everyone uses Peoria. I got that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious. And also to the bus driver that just spoke, kudos, man. I'm all for it. And thank you so much for being a bus driver. Sorry, I had to do that.
No, I'm like that. I was gonna say I second the kudos to a bus driver. I use buses myself, so I appreciate their service. I think right now our focus was on transferring to Peoria BRT because we know that that offers the faster frequency. And when we're talking about the anatomy of the trip, we're, I think, able to maximize the convenience when we're transferring to the most frequent fixed route service. So if I hail my microtransit vehicle and I get dropped off at the BRT station, I have the assurance of knowing that vehicle in the evening, and for this again is talking about evening span of time, that vehicle is going to arrive within 20 minutes. So it's really just giving us the best case scenario for a successful pilot. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be a future zone that's connecting to other routes. And again, this is just evening service time. So it would only be connecting to, the only connections that would be available are those other nightline service routes that are not being replaced. I'm trying to scroll back to my map. Okay, so yeah, what I'm showing now would be the proposed network. So the routes that would not be replaced in the evening are routes 130, 804, 440, and 490. And then we'd be extending Peoria BRT span of service into the evening. So if you're in the north zone, you can still, we did make the southern boundary reach all the way to Nightline Route 440 and also have connection points for Route 130. So I know you said you're in the south, and I don't know if that's the 440 route is helpful to you. But we
It
did.
would be, it would be.
Okay. But
I'm
yeah,
actually closer to the Peoria BRT.
Okay.
And for example, let's say I had to go once a week to Broken Arrow,
Mhm.
but I don't have a car. So, you know, just something to consider,
Okay.
you know, or say I worked in Broken Arrow and lived in Tulsa. The bus driver brought up people from Broken Arrow going to Tulsa to work.
Mhm.
I might live in Tulsa and need to go to Broken Arrow to work,
Mhm.
you know.
Okay.
And I know that's kind of off topic, and please forgive me, but
No, it's okay.
you know, I just thought that that was a valid point that he brought up.
Yeah. And are you thinking about daytime connections or are you talking about evening? Or both?
Either one, honestly, but nighttime would be okay because honestly, my church is out in Broken Arrow and it doesn't make any sense, but it is. And
Mhm.
I know that would be a little bit more convenient for me, you
Mhm.
know. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm talking about changing up the whole route, so that's not a good idea. But but you know, just something, you know.
Okay.
And I've been riding the bus since I was 23 and I'm 44 now. So just saying.
Yeah. You have credibility.
A little bit, just a little.
I want to get more detail. I'm still working on a little while. We need to break the budget up a little bit.
I guess I'll prompt with another question. Were there any questions about service standards that we talked through, either fares, accessibility, or when you do need to transfer? I'm trying to scroll forward to get back to this slide. Well, we have a little more material to go through as far as the public survey that we've opened today and some of our next steps. So chime in if you think of something, but in the meantime, I'll go ahead and share with you all this address for our public survey. We'll have this open over the next several weeks. If you have thoughts that come to mind, we have a quick survey. It's about 10 questions, and the last part of the survey is open-ended. If you want to provide any thoughts or comments, please do so. You can also share this with your networks. We'd love to hear from as many people as possible. We also have posted this link on the Tulsa Transit website. There's a web page dedicated to this project. You can just Google Tulsa Transit, Microtransit, and that should pull up the page. This link is at the top of that page. All right, so I will let Ryan talk through next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. Good morning, everyone. Ryan Billings with the H&TB team. So we're kind of at the end of this kind of phase of the project. We are going to wait for your comments and questions and feedback through the survey, take that into account and start to have a conversation internally about moving this project forward. The H&TB team is going to finalize the implementation plan here in the next few weeks and kind of put a bow on that and provide it to MTTA. We also are going to provide some draft scope language for that procurement One of the things you're probably asking yourselves is, when is this going to happen? I'd love to give you an exact date, but that's not really feasible at this moment. There's several things that have to happen internally before this moves forward, including the feedback from the public through the survey, conversations with MTTA leadership and the board about moving forward, due diligence on the contractual side with the current services that are out there, and a number of other things in preparation for a potential launch of the pilot. What we can do is promise that we are going to come back out to the public when we have more information about potential dates and timing of the launch of the pilot, if that moves forward, but don't have an exact date at this time. So with that, we will be wrapping up the next few weeks, and you should hear back from MTTA over the next few months in terms of dates and timing of the pilot moving forward. Any questions on that? Okay, not hearing anything.
All right, so this is our closeout slide for the meeting today. If you have questions or comments after the meeting, you can go take our survey. So we've repeated that address here on the screen, but also if you prefer to email or call, we also have the email address for Tulsa Transit and the call-in number if you prefer those methods. With that, I'll just say thank you everyone who attended today. We really appreciate your time listening to the presentation and also for the feedback that you've given. It's very valuable to us to make sure we're on the right track going into this pilot.
Hey, Allison, before everybody jumps up the call too, for those who had comments about transit services in Broken Arrow, I want to point out Broken Arrow is currently conducting a transit and mobility study. I shared the link in the chat. So we partner with the city of Broken Arrow to help provide the best service. And I know there's a lot of questions about how to revamp the transit services that we do have that go between the two communities and connect. And I know a lot of those have been in place for a long time, and there's a lot of ideas about how to improve them. So I definitely would suggest following that link and contacting Broken Arrow City administrators about thoughts as well. That kind of helps them have more comments and feedback from residents in both communities, telling them that there's a lot of connection and overlap between there, and they need to hear that. So yeah, thank you. Great comments, and love to hear from drivers and longtime riders. Love to see that. So thank you.
All right. Thank you again, everyone. We look forward to continuing to communicate with you once we have wrapped up our formal part of the study.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aslan. Thank you, everyone, for being on the call today. And we appreciate your comments, and we hope that you will take the survey, because that even more feedback will be great. So hope you have a great day.
You too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for attending, everybody. Hey, Allison, Barrett,
Oh, yeah,
can you all stay on for just a minute, please?
sure.
Okay.
Christy, you can stay too.
Thanks.
I'm asking Ryan. I told Ryan to rejoin.
Yeah. Barrett, let us know when everybody but us have gotten off, please.
It looks like everyone is off now.
Yeah.
Okay. And if Ryan joins, that's great. But I just want to let you know, Scott was reaching out to me. He's like, is that Leonard guy a driver? And I was like, yes.